Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to our first session of our new quarter. Actually, we had it last week, of course, with the introductory lesson. But tonight, we're actually going to get into the text of the Scriptures, Matthew 5, 6, and 7, where we're going to talk about the idea that we are the light. This morning is the children of the light, lesson number 1. And we're taking our text from Matthew chapter 5, verses 21 to 26. And Matthew chapter 5, 21 to 26 deals with the care that we should take in our relationships with others. Jesus talks very specifically about how we speak to others and deal with others in this context. Does so briefly, but very insightfully, and it's something we can certainly take to heart and see the principle, see the direction he's moving with this, so that we can move in that same direction and be the children of light that he intends for us to be. This passage, however, is also it's part of a much larger context that goes all the way through chapter 6. And Jesus is going to give us many examples of what we might call contemporary righteousness versus true righteousness that comes from living out the life that Jesus wants us to live. And of course, this goes on into chapter 6 to verse 18, and he's going to give us 6 examples of what we've heard versus what he says to us and how it really is. So let's look at the context first of all, and it's a twofold context, starting in Matthew chapter 5, verses 13 to 16. This is where he says, "You are the salt of the earth, but if the salt has become tasteless, how can it be made salty again? It's no longer good for anything but to be thrown out and trampled underfoot by men." Then he says, "You are the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden. Nor does anyone light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a lampstand, and it gives light to all who are in the house." Then he says, "Let your light so shine before men in such a way that they may see your good works and glorify your Father who is in heaven." This is the first part of a two-part context in which we find our text. And we've got salt, light, and a hilltop city that Jesus uses here as illustrations or examples of how our lives are to impact the world. But then he goes into verse 17 where he says, "Do not think that I came to abolish the law or the prophets. I did not come to abolish the law, but to fulfill the law. Truly I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not the smallest letter or stroke shall pass from the law until all is accomplished. Whoever then annuls one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same shall be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever keeps and teaches them, he shall be called great in the kingdom of heaven." And then verse 20 is especially pertinent to this second context. It says, "For I say to you that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven." So we've got these two contexts that set the tone for what we're going to study in the rest of these 6 examples of what we've heard compared to what is really the truth. So the first part of that context is the idea of being salt and light and a city, like a city set on a hill. And the second context is the idea that our righteousness, whatever our righteousness is, must surpass the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees, with which the people would have been very familiar, seeing their lives on a daily basis. So let's talk about salt. Why salt? Why does Jesus use salt as an illustration of how our behavior is supposed to impact the world? Number one, they understood, and we understand, that salt is indispensable as a preservative. Today, of course, we've got refrigeration. We get things frozen. We take them home, put them in the freezer, or put them in the refrigerator, and they'll last much longer than they would at normal temperatures. However, before refrigeration, there was salt, or smoke, or sugar, those kinds of things, but especially salt. Salt would have been used as a preservative from almost the get-go because they didn't have refrigeration. So salt was important that way so that food would last longer, but it also makes bland foods much more palatable. I don't know if you remember what your favorite food is with salt, but have you ever eaten French fries with no salt? It's like, what's the point? If you want French fries to be good to eat, you put salt on them. You want them to be really good, you put pepper on them too. When I was a kid, I liked watermelon, but I only liked watermelon if I could put salt on it. I've since outgrown that, thankfully. Don't put salt on watermelon anymore. I've learned that it's much more flavorful without it, but that's watermelon. And sometimes you'll still get a watermelon that's not that tasty, and so you put salt on it, and even a tasteless, bland watermelon becomes good again. It's flavor enriched with salt. So we have that aspect of salt as well. Now, our word salary comes from the Latin word salarium, when salt was used as a trade item. And it's not really clear. Ancient writers, Pliny the Elder especially, wrote about salt and this idea of salt being a salary, being the payment that a soldier would receive for his service. But it's not really clear if that's exactly how it was used. However, from this and from other writings in history, we know that salt was used in a monetary way. It had that much value that you could trade salt as you might trade money. And we have this term, the expression, somebody being worth their salt. In other words, they're worth their pay, they're worth their hire. Whatever we're giving them to get the work done, they're worth that. Most of us are probably familiar with that, but if you're not, now you are. Somebody being worth their salt. In Ezra chapter 4 and verse 14, we have an interesting statement by those who were conspiring against Ezra and those who were rebuilding Jerusalem. They were trying to stop that work, and so they wrote a letter to King Artaxerxes complaining about the work that was going on rebuilding Jerusalem. And they said this in verse 14, "Now because we are in the service of the palace, and it is not fitting for us to see the king's dishonor, therefore we have sent and informed the king." Now that's the New American Standard version of that particular verse, but there's a footnote to the side so that we can understand that a literal reading is, "Now because we eat the salt of the palace." In other words, the idea of eating the salt of the palace meant that they were in the service of the palace. They were receiving payment from the palace or their support from the palace. And they were saying, since we get our support from the palace by means of eating the salt from the palace, then we should not allow that palace to be dishonored. That was their viewpoint. It gives us some insight into the value and the place of salt in ancient times. Also in Leviticus chapter 2, we read about salt being used as it is commanded by God to be used in the offerings that the Israelites offered up before Him. In chapter 2 of Leviticus in verse 11, God says, "No grain offering which you bring to the Lord shall be made with leaven, for you shall not offer up in smoke any leaven or any honey as an offering by fire to the Lord. As an offering of first fruits you shall bring them to the Lord, but they shall not ascend for a soothing aroma on the altar. Every grain offering of yours, moreover, you shall season with salt, so that the salt of the covenant of your God shall not be lacking from your grain offering. With all your offerings you shall offer salt." So what they were saying was, or what God is teaching His people is that I don't want leaven in the offerings that you offer on the altar. I don't want honey in those offerings that you offer on the altar, but I do want salt. Every grain offering you bring shall be seasoned with salt. That's what God says from Leviticus. That's not one of those texts or teachings that we hear very often these days. We think about the animal sacrifices and the grain offerings, the wave offerings or heave offerings, but not very often do we hear about the aspect of salt being involved, which was God's command to do so. Also from Numbers chapter 18, we read this in verse 19. Numbers chapter 18, verse 19. "All the offerings of the holy gifts which the sons of Israel offer to the Lord I have given to you, and your sons and your daughters with you as a perpetual allotment. It is an everlasting covenant of salt before the Lord to you and your descendants with you." And I do not know exactly how God figured salt's importance in these sacrifices, but I do understand from reading both these texts in Leviticus and Numbers that God did consider salt very important. It's not always important that we understand why God wants a certain thing done a certain way. It's simply that we understand He does so that we, with our faith in Him, can do what He wants. Of course, we're not under the sacrificial system anymore. Jesus is our sacrifice. But these passages give us an insight into God's evaluation of salt and how it would have been valued by the people in Jesus' day. Of course, they were living under this covenant. They understood the importance, the value, and the place of salt. So when Jesus mentioned salt, they knew exactly what He was talking about. They knew its impact, its importance, and its place in their everyday life. Now, not only did Jesus say we are the salt of the world, but we are also the light of the world. And in the first century, as you can imagine, when it got dark, it was dark. There's the duh factor. I say that because we typically don't have any extremely dark places in our culture today. Most of us live in urban areas, And you can go outside any time of the night when the sun has gone down, even when there is no moon, and there will be light emanating from somewhere. Somebody's porch light, lights coming out of the windows of their homes, a street light. We've even got one that's probably about 1/8 of a mile from our house, and yet that light does put some light down in our area. And living in Choctaw, those of you who live in Choctaw as we do, you go out at night and you've got light emanating from the west, from Oklahoma City. There's just light all around. But it wasn't like that in the first century. There were no street lights as we know street lights. People used lamps, and that's really about all they had, lamps and fire. That was their source of light. And so when it was dark, it was dark. Therefore, they understood the value of light. And when you have light, you also have security. You've got freedom of movement. You've got clarity to see and understand what things are. I know when I go out at night to walk, even though there is some light, at first, when your eyes are getting adjusted, I carry a flashlight, especially in the summertime, because I know there may be things that I don't want to step on out there, even in the street. So I carry a flashlight. But after a while, my eyes adjust to the light that's out there. I might not need that flashlight anymore. But we understand that light gives you security, freedom of movement, and clarity to see what's before you. Light was a luxurious commodity in the first century. The more money you had, the more oil you could afford, the more lamps you could afford, and therefore the more light you could have. You may recall that Jesus used the example of the 10 virgins in Matthew 25 to teach a lesson about being ready for the Lord's return. So there were 10 virgins, 5 were wise, 5 were foolish. The 5 wise ones, of course, had oil for their lamps and extra oil, but the 5 foolish virgins did not have extra oil, and so when the bridegroom tarried, they ran out of oil. He showed up at midnight. The 5 wise ones had oil to fill their lamps, to keep their lights burning. The 5 foolish virgins did not have that. They went to buy oil, and when they got back, they missed the wedding feast. The doors had been closed, and they missed out. And we have to recognize the idea that Jesus is even teaching us there that to be ready is to have our lights shining, to have oil for our lamps to keep them going. Evil gravitates toward darkness. That's one of the things that Jesus teaches us in the Gospel of John, chapter 3. Chapter 3, starting at verse 19, Jesus says, "This is the judgment, that light has come into the world, and men loved the darkness rather than the light, for their deeds were evil. For everyone who does evil hates the light and does not come to the light, for fear that his deeds will be exposed. But he who practices the truth comes to the light, so that his deeds may be manifested as having been wrought in God." Jesus gives us a great insight into light here, into human nature regarding light. When we don't want our activities to be seen, we are active in the darkness. When we tell a lie, we tell things that cover up the truth. We try to refrain from whatever would shine light on what the truth actually is, and we gravitate more towards other lies and darkness, so to speak, so that the truth cannot be seen. And Jesus says that's the way people's lives are when they do not love the truth. They gravitate towards the darkness, because coming to the light means that our deeds and everything about us will be exposed. And that's what honest people try to do, is come to the light. And so Jesus uses that idea of light is how we are supposed to function and how we're supposed to have an impact in this world. And those, just like when they were listening about the salt, understood the impact of light in their world and would have known what Jesus was talking about and the kind of impact he intended his people to have by using this expression or illustration of light. So he's used salt, he's used light, and then he talks about a city on a hill. Now, a city on a hill obviously would be visible from a great distance, especially to those who would have been traveling back in that day. And you can imagine today we travel, we've got road maps, we've got a GPS. You already have an idea before you start what the road's going to be like and what's going to be on that road. Facilities like restaurants and hotels, gas stations, all kinds of amenities as you travel along modern roadways that they would not have had then, just like we have them today. And so for travelers, it would have been great to see in the distance a city set up on a hill that would have been visible from a great distance because of what that city would have offered them. It would have offered security. If you're sleeping out in the open, you don't know what might happen to you. Wild animals, thieves, anything could happen. The weather might turn bad, but if you're in a town, you have more security. You've got shelter. You've got food and water. You've got all the things that you need for your life to be protected and sustained in a city. And so when you're traveling and you see in a distance a city on a hill, you know there's a place we can go for refuge. There's a place we can go for sustenance. And I think that's what Jesus intended for his people to be like in this world. When people get to know us, when they see our lives, they can see in us a people to whom they can go for comfort, for refuge, for encouragement, for solid teaching, for fellowship, for help. Whatever good there is in this life to be had, it should be able to be had through the people of God who are members, citizens of his kingdom, his church. In addition to security, shelter, food, and water, one of the aspects of a city on a hill would have been, I'm sure, hospitality. And I bring this up because we've got great examples of this in Scripture. If you look at Genesis chapters 18 and 19, of course, in 18, we're not being introduced to a city, but rather Abraham's tent and his place that he was making his home in the wilderness. And it says in chapter 18 of Genesis, verse 1, the Lord appeared to him by the oaks of Mamre while he was sitting in the tent door of the heat of the day. When he lifted up his eyes and looked, behold, 3 men were standing opposite him. And when he saw them, he ran from the tent door to meet them and bowed himself to the earth. And he said, My Lord, if now I have found favor in your sight, please do not pass your servant by. Please let a little water be brought and wash your feet and rest yourselves under the tree. And I will bring a piece of bread that you may refresh yourselves. And after that you can go on, since you have visited your servant. And they said, so do as you have said. And of course, from this point, we can read about how Abraham and Sarah prepared a marvelous meal for these travelers. And that's the way it would have been in that day. You see a traveler, you call him to your place, your abode, you provide hospitality for him. We see that with Abraham here in the wilderness, in his home, but we also see it when we move into the city, more of an urban setting. Chapter 19, Abraham's nephew, Lot, is living in Sodom and Gomorrah, and he has visitors come his way, and he does exactly the same with them. He invites them in. Chapter 19, verses 1 and 3. It says, it came about in those days when there was no king in Israel. Whoops. My apologies. Moved away from Genesis 19. It says, the 2 angels came to Sodom in the evening, as Lot was sitting in the gate of Sodom. And when Lot saw them, he rose to meet them and bowed with his face to the ground. He said, now behold, my lords, please turn aside into your servant's house and spend the night and wash your feet, and then you may rise early and go on your way. They said, however, no, we will spend the night in the square. Yet he urged them strongly. So they turned aside to him and entered his house, and he prepared a feast for them and baked them unleavened bread, and they ate. And of course, shortly after this, the men of the city, worthless men, base men, very sensual men, came, knocked on Lot's door, demanding to have those men that had come to visit. And what we see there is, not only did they find the hospitality of Lot's home, but they found the security and the safety of Lot's home as well. And that's the kind of idea that I believe we would be understanding, or the people in Jesus' day would have been understanding, when they heard him talk about a city set on a hill, a place of shelter, of security, a place where there's food and water, a place where there would be hospitality as they would have understood it in their day. Also in Judges 19, this is a passage I went to mistakenly a little bit ago, but we see the same thing in Judges 19. We see a man in an urban setting meeting strangers, other folks who were traveling, and inviting them into his home. So we've got these 3 examples in Scripture of this kind of hospitality taking place where there are other folks, and that's what a city set on a hill would have meant to travelers in that day. And those listening to Jesus would have understood the value and the importance of a city set on a hill that could be seen from a great distance, and that would have promised safety, security, and the advantages that would have come with being in a town. All right, so we've got these 3 images or examples of what Jesus wanted his people to be like. Salt, light, and a city set on a hill. That's the first aspect of the context. And you're probably thinking by now, Marty, this isn't even in our text. We're just setting it up here. Well, that's exactly right. But if we get it set up right, then we can move into it. And setting up from this context is not just for today's lesson and the text we're looking at, But setting it up in this context will help us to understand every other passage we'll be looking at, every other "you have heard that it hath been said," as Jesus contrasts those with what he says to us. All right, the second aspect of the context, Matthew 5, 17 to 20, is concerning righteousness that surpasses the righteousness of the Pharisees. As we said before, Jesus is going to provide 6 examples of "you've heard that it is this way." And when he does this, I believe he's going to use these examples to expose the contemporary righteousness, if you will, of the Pharisees that fell short of true righteousness. These things are based on their interpretation of the law and their intent to practice the law. And it was very legalistic in some respects, but it left out the spirit of the law. And in reality, wasn't even according to the letter of the law. And that's why I believe Jesus exposes them with these 6 examples. I think there could have been more, but these 6 surely would be sufficient for us to understand what Jesus wanted us to understand about the difference between popular righteousness, for example, and actual righteousness. Now, you've heard, number 1, Matthew chapter 5, 21 to 26. This is our actual text for this lesson, the children of light. Number 1. It says, "You shall not commit murder." Or you have heard that it has been said, "You shall not commit murder, and whoever commits murder shall be liable to the court. But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother shall be guilty before the court. And whoever says to his brother, 'You good for nothing,' shall be guilty before the Supreme Court. And whoever says, 'You fool,' shall be guilty enough to go into fiery hell. Therefore, if you are presenting your offering at the altar, and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your offering there before the altar, and go and first be reconciled to your brother, and then come and present your offering. Make friends quickly with your opponent at law, while you are with him on the way, so that your opponent may not hand you over to the judge, and the judge to the officer, and you be thrown into the prison. Truly I say to you, you will not come out of there until you have paid the last cent." Now, what's this all about? This first contrast that Jesus has with what you've heard that's been said, but what he is saying to us, the reality of this righteousness. Number 1, don't be angry with your brother. Now, some translations say, do not be angry with your brother without cause. And we understand that anger is an emotion that can have a very positive effect. But most of the time, if you're like me, you see anger as a negative, because anger is an energy that rises up within us, and sometimes it's even obvious to others when we're angry, because it causes our face to turn red, our veins to bulge out. It causes a tension, a tensity in our visage, so that people can see that there's something wrong with that guy. He is upset. Anger is not healthy to hold on to. It can be a positive force to motivate us to do something good about something that's wrong, but it can also, if we are not careful, compel us to do things that we should not do and say things that we should not say. And that seems to be what Jesus is focusing on here. Now, here's the contrast. You've heard that it's been said, "You shall not commit murder." The idea being anything short of murder is okay. As long as you don't kill somebody, that's what the law says, you shall not commit murder. So you can do almost anything else. I believe that's why Jesus brings up these other ideas. Don't even be angry with your brother. He does not want us to harbor anger against any of our brethren. And then he says, don't say, "You good for nothing." And do not say, "You fool." It's like he's talking about an escalation of our anger and our feelings towards others. We're angry with them. And so out of our anger, we think about them, and we eventually decide something wrong with them. They're just a good for nothing. Or not only are they good for nothing, but our anger might increase and build to the intensity where we say, "Just a fool, just a fool." And when we say someone's a fool in our own minds, we're also saying with that almost certainly that we have no regard for them as a person. They're just a fool. We have no regard for them. They're good for nothing. And we would understand that God does not want us to have that kind of an estimation of our fellow man, if there's any way around it. What Jesus says is, when you're angry with your brother, when you want to say, you good for nothing, you fool, that's the time we need to find a way to become reconciled to our brother. And he even says to be reconciled with our brother before we go to worship. Verse 23, therefore, if you're presenting your offering at the altar, you're there, you're at the altar, you've brought your gift, your sacrifice, whatever it is for your own sin or whatever that offering might be, you realize, it comes to your mind that you have a brother who has something against you. And he says you leave your offering there. You cease your worship and you leave that place of worship to go find your brother and to be reconciled to your brother. That's what we are to do first before we worship. And once we've been reconciled, then we come back and we present our offering to God. That's what God says that we should do. And he also teaches us we should be reconciled quickly. That's the part in verse 25 where it says, make friends quickly with your opponent at law. While you're on the way to the courts, he pictures this for us. Talk to them. Work this out before you get to the magistrates, because if you get before the magistrates, the judge, they might see things his way and condemn you, and you might find yourself condemned and thrown in prison when you should have worked this out before you even got to that point. That's what Jesus is saying. This is all about interpersonal relationships. It's about how we value one another. You've heard that it's been said, don't kill people, but I'm telling you, that's not the only problem there could be. I'm telling you, don't even be angry with your brother. Don't call your brother a good for nothing. Don't call your brother a fool. If you know your brother's got something against you, instead of fighting with him or trying to defend yourself, go to your brother, work this out between you and him so that you won't be caught short when the judgment arrives. That's the illustration, that's the picture that Jesus is giving us. Now, what's Jesus' point? We've been talking about his point, but there's one true light, and that's Jesus, and he is leading us in our thought process to how we're supposed to have relationships with others and how we're supposed to value others. There are several other passages that we need to go to with regard to this. Of course, Jesus doesn't go to all those teachings immediately. He leaves those for us. They're elsewhere in the Word. But we go to Matthew chapter 7, right here in the Sermon on the Mount, and we see an excellent teaching that he gives us about relationships. So simple, so applicable, so right on in regard to how we live every day with people. Matthew chapter 7 and verse 12. Jesus says, in everything, therefore, treat people the same way you want them to treat you, for this is the law and the prophets. That's it. Treat other people the way you want to be treated. And he says, this is the law and the prophets. Now, I don't know when the last time is you looked at the law. The law was the first 5 books, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. There's a lot of material in Genesis to Deuteronomy. 5 books of the law. The Jews called it the Torah as well as the law. There's also the prophets that Jesus mentioned. How many prophets? Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Daniel, many other prophets. There were 5 that we call major prophetic works. 2 of those written by Jeremiah and Lamentations, and then there are the 12 what we call minor prophets. So I've got all these words of prophecy, and Jesus says when you treat other people the way you want to be treated, that fulfills all the teaching that there is in the law and the prophets. All of that written material, all that expression of God's mind and His will for us is summed up in this simple teaching: treat others the way you want to be treated. Of course, murdering somebody is not treating anybody the way we want to be treated. But if you back off from murder and you look even a little farther down below that, do you want somebody to call you or even think of you as a good for nothing? Of course not. How about a fool? Of course not. If anybody feels that way towards you, wouldn't you want them to come to you and say, hey, we've got this between us, and I know you might think less of me than I want you to. Can we work this out? What would your attitude be towards them? If you know that people sincerely, genuinely want to work things out if there's any kind of a problem, that tends to soften our hearts. It makes us feel much more warmly towards them when they want to get things worked out. And I think that's exactly what Jesus wants of us all. That softness, that tenderness, that genuine love and care and compassion. that we ought to be feeling for each other, because he exampled that for us in his life. In Matthew chapter 18, there's somewhat of a brother to this passage in Matthew 5 that we've been studying, where Matthew 5, Jesus teaches us to go to our brother if we think he's got something against us. In Matthew 18, Jesus turns it around and says, if you've got something against your brother, you go to him, work it out, be reconciled to your brother. We won't look at the details of that, but it's Matthew chapter 18, verses 15 through 20, if you want to look at that yourself. Incidentally, this is the context in which Jesus says, where 2 or 3 are gathered together in my name, there I am with you. Now, Jesus is giving us that promise when we're trying to work things out with another brother. That's what context Jesus says that in. When we're trying to work something out to reconcile with a brother, Jesus is going to be there. In Matthew chapter 22, Jesus is asked about the great commandment in the law. Matthew chapter 22, starting at verse 34, we read about the Pharisees the Pharisees hear that Jesus has silenced the Sadducees, and so they want to test him. And one of them, who's a lawyer, asks a question, says, "Teacher, which is the great commandment in the law?" And Jesus simply says this: "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. This is the great and foremost commandment. The second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself." And then he says again, "On these 2 commandments depend the whole law and the prophets." Here we're back to this idea of the law and the prophets. Everything in the law and the prophets is fulfilled, is taken care of, if we, from chapter 7 and verse 12, treat our brother as we want to be treated. And from here, the greatest commandment and its partner likened to it, treat others the way you want to be treated. Love your neighbor as you love yourself, and love God first and foremost with everything you have. That love, that compassion, that desire to reach out and be connected with others in a warm, affectionate, compassionate way is the fulfillment of God's law. That's what he wants with us, and that's what he wants us to have among ourselves. And so it's the fulfillment of all these things. And that's what Jesus is teaching us there in Matthew chapter 5 in this particular text. Now we go from Matthew to John, still looking at this idea of how we relate to one another. And Jesus says this in John chapter 13, verses 34 and 35. "A new commandment I give you, that you love one another, even as I have loved you, that you also love one another. By this all men will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another." So how's the world going to know that we are the Lord's church? How's the world going to know that we're his disciples? If we have love for one another. We can keep all the teachings, the external teachings. We can get the name right. We can get baptism right. We can get Bible study right. We can get prayer right. But if we fail to love one another, then we will truly fail the best way to show the world that we are Jesus' disciples. That's what the world will see, according to Jesus, and that's what the world will understand makes us his followers. Very profound, I think, and very telling. Now, he says it here in chapter 13, 34, and 35, but he also says it in chapter 15, verse 12. 15, verse 12, he says, "This is my commandment, that you love one another just as I have loved you." That's a pretty tall order, isn't it, to love one another as Jesus loves us? But that's his teaching to us. Again, chapter 15, verse 17, "This I command you, that you love one another." Why do you think he repeated that teaching 3 times? I think you know. Sometimes there are things we need to be hit with again and again and again. Because we'll have a teaching come our way, and like we use the illustration, it's like the birds, it just kind of goes right over our head. Jesus wants this one to stick, and so he tells us, love one another, love one another, love one another. And maybe finally we'll get the idea. And then there's John 17, verses 20 to 23. Right in the middle of Jesus' prayer to God. This is his prayer before he was going to be arrested and tried and crucified. And Jesus says this, John chapter 17, verse 20. "I do not ask on behalf of these alone, but for those also who believe in me through their word, that they may all be one, even as you, Father, are in me and I in you, that they also may be one in us, so that the world may believe that you sent me." That was part of Jesus' prayer, that his followers would be one, just as he and the Father are one. And he says about that, if we are one, if we are united, and if we're going to be united, it's going to take some love, it's going to take some compassion, it's going to take forbearance and all the things that are required when we love one another. But if we are united as Jesus wants us to be united, that will be a sign to the world that God has sent Jesus. Our love shows the world that we're his disciples. Our unity shows the world that God has sent his Son. What kind of evangelistic works are those two very simple yet profound things? To love one another, to be united with one another. How well will they work to show the world what we want to show them about ourselves and about God, especially about God? Well, this isn't the only time he says it here. That's verses 20 and 21. But if we look at 22 and 23, he's going to repeat this idea. Look at verse 23. I in them and you in me, so that they may be perfected in unity, so that the world may know that you sent me and love them, even as you have loved me. There it is again. Twice he brings this to the attention of God, and the Holy Spirit inspires John to write it down this way, puts it in there twice, so that twice we can see if we unite with one another as followers of Christ, this will be the greatest testimony possible to the world that God has indeed sent his Son. I don't know if we would have come up with that on our own, but Jesus reveals this truth to us just like he does so many others. Well, what's our conclusion? We need to end this, bring it to a conclusion. Number one, our behavior should impact the world around us with the influence of God. Number two, our behavior should surpass that, what is merely acceptable according to contemporary wisdom, and go the second mile, as Jesus taught in Matthew 5:41. And number three, these things must be specifically practiced in our behavior towards our fellow man. So there's our class for this morning, our first session on children of light. Thank you very much. I'll see you, Lord willing, when I get back.